I'll just put up my first slide. Let's see. I have to share my screen. Is that working? Did everybody see that?
Yep, looks good, Phil. We can see your first slide.
Okay, good. Oh. Go back. Okay.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you very much. So sea stars of the West Coast, and by that I'm referring primarily to the coast from Southeast Alaska to Puget Sound. That's what I know most about. And we're going to look at different aspects of sea stars tonight, like their feeding habits, how they reproduce, the ecology, and predator-prey interactions and things like that. So without further ado, I'll carry on to the next slide and get some of the dry stuff out of the way. This is the taxonomy. So the phylum Echinodermata, it breaks down, the Greek is for spiny, echino, and derm is skin, so spiny skinned animals. And it includes, of course, sea stars, which we're going to talk tonight, and also brittle stars, which are referred to as ophiuroids. Sea urchins are the echinoids. Sea lilies are crinoids. And sea cucumbers are holothuroids. And there's another small group called sea daisies, which have relatively recently discovered. They're very tiny animals. There's only about three or four species known so far. They're about the size of a dime, and they occur in deep water on sunken wood for some reason. So initially they were thought to be a new class, but now they've been put into the asteroids. So they're part of the asteroidea, but they're interesting tiny animals. So what are the characteristics of echinoderms? Well, first of all, they're have pentaradial symmetry, which is like a 5-spoked wheel. That's at least in the adult. And they're, as you know, sea stars mainly have 5 arms, but they go up to 20 or so. They have a calcareous skeleton, so that goes all the way from the solid sphere of a sea urchin to the sea cucumbers, where the skeleton is just tiny crystals in the skin of calcium carbonate. They all have a water vascular system, and this is what operates the tube feet of sea stars and the other groups. It's like a closed hydraulic system. So that, as you know, with hydraulics, when you apply a pressure, it sends it throughout the whole system. So the tube feet are operated like that, with a bulb at the top, and that squeezes and pushes the tube foot out. Excuse me. They also have something called catch connective tissue. This is quite unusual. It's peculiar to the echinoderms. It's a connective tissue like our tendons and other ligaments in our body is connective tissue. But in echinoderms, it's innervated, so they can actually make it stiff or relaxed with a nerve impulse, which no other animals can do that. So things like a sea lily with its arms up in the air, it can just lock them in place. And by doing that, it saves energy. It doesn't have to use its muscles to keep its arms in place. And they also have things called pedicellaria, these pincer-like little organelles that are on the outer surface of sea stars and all the other echinoderms. and that they're very important in repelling predators and anything that tries to attach to them. So this is a shot of a dredge that we did off the west coast of Vancouver Island, just to show you just how common echinoderms are. Just about everything in this dredge is an echinoderm, from these large sea cucumbers, sea urchins, and all these white things are brittle stars. But the only thing that isn't a echinoderm that can see is that there's a fish here. Looks like a sipunculid down here, a peanut worm as it's called. And that might be another fish here. But as you can see, it's primarily echinoderms. So they're very prolific on the west coast. And just to give you an idea of the numbers, we have 44 on the continental shelf. That's from the intertidal to 200 meters. And 38 deeper than 200 meters, for a total of 82. And that's in a span of 11 degrees of latitude. And just to compare that with the east coast of North America, we have 68 species all the way from Labrador to Florida. Of course, I must say these numbers might be a little bit different now, but the point is the same, I think. That and that's a span of 22 degrees of latitude, so twice the distance, but a lot fewer species. So the Northeast Pacific is definitely very prolific in sea stars. So today we're going to look at the largest sea star we have, the sunflower star, as was mentioned prior to the talk. It's a prolific species. It has a lot of behaviors, important behaviors, and predator-prey interactions. And then we're going to go down and look at the smallest of our sea stars, the six-armed star, and the things that it lives on and the way it lives. I'm going to mention the cushion star. It's quite a bit different than pretty well all the other sea stars in the way it's constructed. I'll explain that later. Then we'll look at this common intertidal animals like the blood star and the purple star and how they interact with their environment. And I mentioned this one is the long-range star, Stylisterius. It catches fish. It's got a very novel method of doing that, which I'll explain later. And something about the rose star. This is similar to the sunflower star, it's just a lot smaller. But it's I mentioned this because there's a particular study I want to talk to you about, which was done in Auk Bay in Southeast Alaska, where a researcher there followed the population of these animals for 17 years. So it's one of the longest running studies of sea stars, and gives us some insights into how old they get and what they do and how they recover from injuries and things like that. So that's the program tonight. A little bit about the internal anatomy of the sea star. As you can see here, we have the particular thing about sea stars is they have two stomachs. This lower one, which is the, sorry. Here, this is the cardiac stomach, so-called, and the one above it is the pyloric stomach. So that the cardiac stomach is actually able to push out through its mouth and envelop any of its prey that can't fit through the mouth. So it can digest things externally. And you'll often see them in positions with something wrapped around, or that they're wrapped around digesting very slowly. And there has two gonads in each arm. They usually they're separate sexes. And so when food is brought into the cardiac stomach, it's then transferred into the pyloric stomach, and then the particles then go out into the pyloric ceca, which is kind of like our liver, where it stores the food and nourishes the rest of the body. I'll talk about the water vascular system in the next image. I've sort of isolated the water vascular system, which is the system that operates all the tube feet. And you can see these ampullae, which control each tube foot. And there's a ring canal. And this thing called the madreporite, which is what you see on the top of a sea star, that little white dot or yellow dot. That's if it needs to replenish the fluid in the system, it draws fresh seawater in through this madreporite down the stone canal and into the ring canal. And within this system here, there are a number of cells that will attack any bacteria that come in, so they don't upset the system and contaminate the rest of the fluid. It also has these so-called Tiedemann's bodies, which are also concentrations of cells which will attack any bacteria that develop inside the water vascular system. And if you do a cross section through one of the legs, you'll see these are the gonads on the bottom and the pyloric ceca up above. The thing I want to point out is the gills, which also called, the technical term is dermal branchiae. Now, as you can see there on the upper surface of the arms and the body, and they have direct contact with the seawater, and so it absorbs oxygen right through the membranes, and then it's brought down into the coelomic cavity and distributed to the rest of the organs. So that those gills becomes important when we talk about the wasting disease, which I'll talk about later. So that's the general anatomy of sea stars, and here's just a close-up of the gills on the surface of a leather star. You can see just how prolific they are. So each one of those is a little extension of the coelomic cavity inside. And I mentioned pedicelaria. These are examples of the different forms of pedicelaria. Now these are tiny organelles on the outer surface of sea stars, which help to control, anything that might settle onto the surface of the sea star, like barnacle larvae that are looking for a place to attach, that you don't really want them attached. So any larvae that crawl around will trigger these things and they'll snap shut, a bit like Venus flytrap. As soon as something touches them, they close. And different species have different forms of pedicelaria. This is an interesting one here, which I'll talk about later. Looks like the jaws of a snake. So they're very important for the survival of the animals. And so let's get started. Here's one I mentioned before, Stylisterius, the long-rayed star. This is the fish-catching sea star. How does it do that? Well, if you look closely, actually, this is an image of the type of little sculpins that tend to flit around on the bottom of the ocean. And if they happen to blunder into the back of one of these, they immediately are snared by these the pedicelaria. Now, if you look, here's the spines, and you can see that wreath around them. here's a diagrammatic view. So these whole wreath of pedicellariae are like little sugar tongs that are sitting open there waiting. And as soon as something touches them, they snap shut, and they can actually snare a fish. I've taken one of these sea stars, put it in a white bucket of seawater, and you drop a sculpin in, and it immediately goes to the darkest part of the bucket, which is the back of one of these. Instantaneously, they're snared, and it's quite amazing just how effective they are at catching them. And then once it's snared, very slowly, the sea star arrives, twists itself around, and eventually applies its stomach out through the mouth and onto the fish. And I must say, when I saw that, I did retrieve the fish and prevented it from being eaten. But it's quite a novel way that it has of catching fish, and that's its diet. And here's a close-up of the pedicellariae that do the job. So you can see they're just like a snake jaw with the teeth pointing inward. So that's Stylosteris, the fish-eating star. Now a little bit about reproduction. For the most part, sea stars are separate sexes and are broadcast fertilizers. So at certain time of the year, they sort of aggregate and release eggs and sperm together. They're stimulated to release them together by certain environmental cues, I suppose. And they fertilize and they develop in the water through the different stages. And so some of them are like the bipinnaria, are feeding larvae. So they feed on plankton. And the interesting thing about them is, the larva is a bilaterally symmetrical. So as opposed to being radial, that comes later. So they spend a few weeks in the open ocean, and eventually they develop these legs and settle down onto the bottom. And there they undergo this amazing transformation or metamorphosis, where they twist and go from a bilateral animal to a radially symmetrical animal. It's quite an amazing process. And here's just a picture of a blood star, which is in the sort of spawning position. Many species do it this way. They erect on their arm tips, trying to get up into the current so that the sperm gets dissipated by the currents. So many other species do the same thing. Now, the six-armed star is one of the few that broods its eggs. So this is, so the female releases her eggs, but maintains them underneath her body. And then the males nearby will release sperm, and the sperm float in and fertilize the eggs in situ. So the female has them under her body like this. You can see these orange eggs, and there they develop. And simply once they reach the tiny sea star stage, they then just crawl away. So you often find large aggregations of these six-armed stars because they all came from one mother in one location on a rock. So that helps when it comes spawning time, that they're all nearby. So that's one of the few that broods its eggs. Now let's say a little bit about feeding. Of course, each species tends to have a different preference for food. There's a lot of overlap, but partly to allow them to survive, so they're not competing with each other. So this small 6-armed star is very small, so it naturally feeds on small things like small these chitons, lion chitons, these top shells, things like that. Wrinkled amphissa. And here's one that we turned over, and there it has one of these amphissa that it's feeding on. So most of the larger sea stars don't bother with the smaller animals. They only sometimes get them in sort of incidentally. Here's a interesting star. It's called the mud star. Now, if you're a scuba diver, or not likely to see these because they're usually in mud, and I know scuba divers don't tend to dive on the mud. So they're also usually partially buried in the mud. But they have interesting that they feed on mud essentially. You can see this picture where the mud is filling the stomach. You can see through the aboral surface. And occasionally in muddy areas, you occasionally get anoxic conditions because there's mud there, because there isn't a lot of current. So sometimes you get anoxic water building up. So that's a problem for these. So they have an interesting method. This thing on the top here is called the epiproctal cone, and it's able to expand itself quite a bit. And the whole upper surface, there's a diagram here that shows their gyrations. So if they have some anoxic condition, they start to expand the upper surface, and it goes into these gyrations where it's moving the coelomic fluid around and trying to get as much exposure to clean water or to oxygenated water, which may be up above, a little bit higher above the surface. So they go through these great gyrations, trying to get the upper surface oxygenated. So that's the mud star that does that. Now this diagram, it's from Sloan and Robinson. It shows the different depths to which some animals can actually, some sea stars can burrow. Pycnopodia helianthoides, that's the sunflower star that we know well. And it excavates these amazing cavities down 25 centimeters. And they usually go after clams in that situation. And they actually remove the particles like one by one using their tube feet. So it's a very long, slow process. And then the other one, Mediaster, which is the vermilion star. It usually exposes, puts its stomach onto sort of seaweed and dead animals and things like that. So it's, and it only goes down, see, about 2 centimeters. Then there's Pisaster brevispinus, the giant pink star. It's amazing set of tube feet that it can put down, look like about 30 centimeters. So they partially remove sediment, and then they send their tube feet down and grab a hold of clams that are down below. They kind of go down the siphon hole and kind of by brute force, just yank them slowly up to the surface and then devour them. And Luidia is the sand star, and it's sort of like intermediate. It goes after things in the mud and then the sediment, like probably small snails and things like polychaetes and so on. So they all have their ways of excavating and getting getting at their prey. So let's talk about the sunflower star, which has been recorded up to 1 meter in diameter. It's, I think, one of the largest sea stars in the world. There may be some others that might be bigger in diameter, but not as heavy as the sunflower star. So what does it do? This is shows it excavating, digging out some of the sediment, looking for clams. And the clam really doesn't have much way of escaping apart from digging down a bit farther, but it can only go so far, and then it gets gobbled up. The heart urchin is heart cockle rather, is right near the surface. If you look at a diagram, because they have a very short siphon, they don't dig themselves very deep. So they're fairly near the surface. So it's fairly easy pickings for a sea star to come along and get at it. But it has a secret weapon. You can see that's large foot it has at the opposite the siphon. And when it senses danger, like a sunflower star hovering nearby, it goes into amazing pole vault, and it drives that foot down and thrusts it numerous times and actually pole vaults its way away from the marauding sea star. So it's often quite effective at escaping. So that's the heart cockle. So the other animal that sunflower stars like to go after are the pink scallops, or also known as the swimming scallops. So they're very active. They have a set of eyes around the mantle edge, but they can probably sense them, the sense of smell as much as anything. So when a Pycnopodia comes along, they're alerted, and they immediately go into clapping their shells together and swimming away. It's quite comical to see this happening when a sunflower star comes up over the edge of a rock, and there's a bunch of swimming scallops that just go berserk and swim off in every direction. So sometimes you wonder if the sunflower star gets anything, but obviously they do. And I've even seen them go after giant red urchins. I remember seeing one that engulfed a red urchin, the whole thing, and its spines were sticking out through the disc of the sea star. So they somehow were able to, digest the innards of the urchin and then expel the shell later. But so they're quite voracious. And the abalone is also another one that shows an amazing escape response. They have these tentacles, which are sensory. They have eyes at the front here. And they also sense the sunflower star coming along. And immediately this large foot goes into great undulations, and it actually speeds away and on the rock. And at the same time, this shell, the muscle attaching the shell, twists violently, so that if the star has actually got any tube feet attached to it, it can usually throw them off and get out of the way. So as the sunflower star is a great predator, but there's lots of things that have ways of escaping. So that sort of levels the playing field, so to speak. And then the sea star wasting disease came along. And here's some photos courtesy of my friend Neil McDaniel, who is a diver and biologist. And he's still actively diving and taking photographs. And this first shot is an Indian arm, which is at the end of Burrard Inlet there. You can see this is in October of 2013. And that's the year when this disease started. And it was, they think it was triggered by a large warming blob of water that came into the British Columbia coast and Washington and raised the temperature. And down below here on the lower left, they've got the remains of a Pycnopodia in Howe Sound, also in about a week later in 2013. And in the upper right, we've got in the year later, in the 2014, in Seashell Inlet, the remains of a Pycnopodia sunflower star, which is obviously succumbed to the disease. And down below on the lower right, the Crossester paposus, the rose star. This is also in Seashell Inlet in 2014. So that was the height of when it started, and it's carried on. We're still feeling the effects. And this next shot here, this is some shots I took in Long Beach in June of 23. And these are not doing too well. They've probably got the wasting disease. And I just want to mention that there is a group that are trying to monitor what's happening with the sea star populations. And it's if you go to seastarwasting.org, there's a website there. You can send in your observations, photographs, and observations of not just diseased animals, but healthy animals as well. And they're interested in finding out where they are. So it's a really useful site. So what causes sea star wasting disease? Well, initially it was thought to be caused by a type of virus that developed after the warm water blob came in and raised the water temperature about 2 degrees above normal in 2013. But since then, they seem to have discounted that it's a virus, and they really have yet to find a cause that's definitive. So how it seems to be something to do with the upper surfaces of sea stars, which is where the gills are, somehow gets contaminated by organic matter. It was thought that maybe during the heat wave, the blob, that a lot of plankton died and then settled down to the bottom and covered the upper surfaces of some sea stars, especially in quiet waters. And there the bacteria then came in to decompose the organic matter and essentially used up all the oxygen. So the sea stars weren't able to breathe or get enough oxygen to survive. That's one theory. Because those species with a smooth aboral surface seem to be a little less affected by this disease, as if the surfaces would get cleaned off more easily with currents, because the surfaces was a bit smoother. That's some of them, of course, succumbed as well, but generally speaking, those seem to have escaped the disease more than ones with a rough upper surface. And sunflower star populations appear to have diminished by 90% over the whole range from Alaska down to California. And they're now considered critically endangered by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So interestingly, there's a captive breeding program in Washington State where they're trying to raise sunflower stars in order to release them in areas that have been hard hit in the hopes of restoring the balance. And they found that the optimum temperature for the larval development was actually 4 degrees higher than the ambient temperatures in the Salish Sea where these studies was done. So that just the raising of the temperature doesn't seem like enough to explain why sunflower stars have been hit so hard. So it's obviously a whole combination of things that are at work. So hopefully more information will come out and we'll eventually know what did cause it. So let's move on to some of the other species. This is the giant pink star, Pisaster brevispinus, in the act of, I think I showed you that diagram with the central tube feet have been sent down and grabbed hold of the clam and then yarded up, and I think this neck. So this shows how big they are. They're a massive species, so they've got a lot of leverage when it comes to pulling clams out of the mud. And here's one that's obviously got a clam or something that it's wrapped around and is in the process of digesting it. What's happening? Okay, the leather star, and this is one that seems to have got away with not getting the disease quite as much as the others. Now, what does it do for a living? Well, it tends to feed on anemones, like the white-plumed anemone, the swimming anemone, and this is another interesting reaction when a leather star is just needs to touch the base of the swimming anemone, and it'll suddenly go berserk and extend its column up and start flipping from side to side. And eventually it actually tears its pedal disc off the rock and undulates its body back and forth and swims up into the water column, and hopefully catching a current and drifting away from the marauding leather star. So it's another really effective escape reaction. So the other sort of more common species that we know of in the intertidal zone, like the blood star, they tend to feed on things like encrusting sponges and bryozoans or moss animals. And just by applying their stomach to the surfaces, they're able to digest parts of it. They also eat plankton. So they have a way of drawing a current into the mouth region and getting plankton out of the water. And one of its relatives, the fat Henricia, excuse me, we often see draped over, this is a boot sponge underneath here. Oh. No. There. Often see them draped over these boot sponges. And the thought is that they may be trying to tap into the feeding current of the sponge, because the sponge, its lateral wall, it actually draws water in through the pores. And so this sea star here may be trying to tap into that current of water that's drawing food in and intercepting it. That's at least a theory. I don't know whether it's been proven one way or the other. Now here's the spiny red sea star. Now it was originally called Pipisteria spinosa, which that's what it's called in my book. But since then, the name has been changed. And the reason for that is they did DNA studies and they found that the species in the Atlantic, which is Pipisteria phrygiana, was essentially the same as the one we have here, using DNA. So they changed the name to be the same as the Atlantic species. But anyway, the biology is still the same. Just a minute. Oh. So this is a species that likes to attack sea pens, which are usually in softer sediments. And when the sea pen actually contracts when it's attacked by something, and then this sea star is actually able to dissolve, at least get out the top part of the sea pen. They also eat Gersemia, the soft coral seen here. And you'll notice on the back of the sea star, these little white dots, those are the Pedicelaria, which look like little clamshells, like bivalve Pedicelaria. So those are all in the open position, waiting for something to crawl around on it and get crunched. So that's the spiny red sea star. Now here's the rose star, which is similar looking to the sunflower star, but quite a bit smaller. And its favorite food is also sea pens and bivalves of various kinds, scallops, things like that. It'll even attack other stars like the mottled star. Even though a mottled star can get quite large, this somehow attacks these large stars. Now this is a species that was studied, I mentioned earlier, by Richard Carlson from Auk Bay in Alaska. And he did a 17-year study where he followed the whole population of rose stars in the bay just outside the marine station. I had the opportunity to go with him on one of his dives, and he had a very interesting way of marking the animals. He used colored vegetable dye, injecting it into certain legs, relative to where the madreporite was, and he was actually able to mark 956 individuals and follow them for 17 years, or some of them. Interestingly, he sometimes found them 3 kilometers away from where he had originally marked them. So it was an amazing study that hasn't been, I don't think, any other study of its kind. So he was able to determine that some individuals live at least 20 years. And if the study had gone longer, he might have got even older. But there's very few studies have been done that tell how old a sea star is. They have such powers of regeneration that they can kind of replace their tissues regularly. So it's hard to figure out how old it is by looking at it or looking at aspects of their body. So they're relatively slow growing. He found that it took 4 to 9 years to regrow an arm completely. And he also found that particular population 89% of them fed on one species of scallop. So it was a very interesting study that few have equaled since then. Some of the species are quite varied in their color. This is the mottled star. So they look like different species, but in fact, they're all the same species, just variations. And the other one that has similar variation is the bat star, Asterina miniata, which again used to be called Pateria miniata. And they occur on exposed west coast, but in protected bays. So they're sort of, you don't find them on the inside waters in Georgia Strait, but they've got all sorts of different color combinations seen here. And they're sort of detritus feeders. They just feed on dead material like seaweed and any dead animals, worms and things that they find. So they're kind of cleaning up. Now, this is Pisaster ocratius, the purple star, which is kind of iconic when it comes to intertidal sea stars. That's what most people think of when they think of sea stars. And they've been hit fairly hard in some areas with the wasting disease, but most of the places I've been to, they seem to be reasonably healthy. There may be one or two specimens have the disease, but I'm hoping they're going to recover. And their role in the intertidal zone is very important. They've been named as a keystone species. This was a term coined by, what was his name? I just forgotten. A worker in
Payne.
Payne, thank you. Not Roger Payne. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it's Roger.
Yeah, Robert Payne.
Robert,
yeah. Yes. The University of Victoria, no, Washington, University of Washington. He did a study, a long-term study on the island of Tatoosh Island off the coast of Washington there. He built little fences from the upper intertidal all the way down to zero tide in a swath down from the upper to the lower. And then he removed all the purple sea stars from that swath and then followed what happened after that for the next several years. And probably a lot of his students carried on that work. And he found normally we have quite a definite line, which the lower end of the mussel zone, as you can see here, you can see a few sea stars here and another one there feeding on the mussels. They found, of course, that the mussels then spread all the way down. And as a result, the diversity of life in that area was reduced because the mussels kind of crowd out lots of other animals like chitons and things that need to have some open space to move in. So it's a very interesting study, and he coined the phrase keystone species, which has been used now for things like sea otters and wolf packs, and they're now often called keystone species because of their major effect they have on their environment. So that's the purple star that feeds on mussels. Here you can see one in the act. So they essentially use their 2 feet to kind of pull the shells apart a little bit, just enough to slide the piece of their stomach in, and then they digest it from the inside. So you'll see these open shells lying around from time to time as a result of predation by the purple star. Here's another, the rainbow star, which also feeds on clams. Here it is in the act of digesting one. Now it feeds on a species called Humillaria, which shown here, this very highly ridged kind of a clam. And it's very few other species that feed on clams are able to get this one open, but somehow Orthosterius has found a way. I don't know how it does that, what the explanation is, but they've got a very tight shell. There's very little space between the shells. So most sea stars can't seem to get their stomach in to digest it, but Orthosterius has found a way. And here's a relatively rare species, the thorny star, the Paraneopsis. We don't know too much about it. I don't see it that often. It's, I think I took this photograph in the Queen Charlotte Islands, and it was probably feeding on these cup corals, which you see in the background, because that particular rock where this was found didn't really have much else except these cup corals. So we assume that's what it was feeding on. But that's one that is relatively rare and not seen too often by scuba divers. Now here's the morning sun star, which is another voracious predator, and apparently it too has not done very well in the wasting disease. Somehow it's succumbed quite heavily. But normally it's a predator, and it feeds on things like other sea stars, in this case, the leather star. Here it is preparing to attack, and here it is just about ready to get it into a 20-arm hammerlock. And once it's done that, the leather star can't get away, and then the sun star then applies its stomach to the top side of the leather star and starts to eat it away. Now, this is an interesting species, this cushion star. It's different than most other species in the way it's built. It's also called a slime star for reasons I'll show you in a minute. Now, if you take a cross section through this, actually this is a regular sea star. You can see these are the ossicles that make up the skeleton. The DB is dermal branchii, which are the gills. SP is a spine, and PD is a pedicellaria. Now that's kind of the normal form of a sea star. But if you look at the cushion star, it's got this extra skin, this supradorsal membrane. And it's got this space in between its regular body and the supradorsal membrane. And this is called the nidamental chamber, which implies that that's where the eggs develop. But in the case of our local species, it doesn't retain the eggs. The eggs come in there, and then it expels them through the pore in the top, so that they're fertilized out in situ, or out in the water. So its gills are protected inside this nidamental chamber, and it draws water in through these pores in the bottom, down by the tube feet, and it aerates the gills. If you're a scuba diver and see them in action, you can often see them pulsing and expanding and contracting and flushing this nidamental chamber to get oxygen. So the reason they're also called slime star is because they can, at a moment's notice, secrete amazing amounts of slime. So it all comes out through these pores and covers the outer body shown here. So it's just oozing out everywhere. And this mucus is toxic to a lot of things like crabs and snails can't survive in it. It repels most other predators as well. So it's a very effective mechanism that wards off its enemies. And finally, this is the striped sunstar, a relative of the other morning sunstar. Occasionally, you'll find them intertidally. This was probably an exposed West Coast situation. And they are particular liking for sea cucumbers, like the orange cucumber seen here. And here's one in the act of attacking a sea cucumber, and the cucumber is expanding and contracting and trying to get out of its grip, but it's pretty well doomed, I think. And it's also would feed on these small cucumbers that occur in large mats on the upper surfaces of rocks. So those are the species that these striped sunstar tends to feed on. They also feed on other things, but those would be the main members of their diet. So, how are we doing for time? This is, I've shown you 21 of the 44 species of sea stars living from Southeast Alaska to Puget Sound. And if you want to know more, as Gloria mentioned, there's a sea star book put out by the Royal BC Museum, which I authored. And although some of the names need updating because it's 20 years old now, the biology is pretty much the same. And we'll call it a day there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phil.
Okay.
I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking you for this great talk and learning a little bit about all the 21 species that you introduced to us. At this point, I would love to open up to a few minutes of questions. If you have a couple minutes, I invite you to turn your videos on and either raise your hand or put it in the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask a question if you have any.
I'll close this off here.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And there is in the chat, a couple minutes ago, there was a discussion about why do tube feet continue to be attached to glass containers even after the sea star has been removed? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, apparently tube feet they look like suckers and they act like suckers, but they also have an adhesive that the animal secretes. So it's actually sticks, literally.
So my question would be, when it lifts the tube foot up, does it secrete another chemical to remove the adhesive?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure whether it's got an antidote to it or yeah.
To get unstuck.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
If I could pipe in there for a second, is that okay? Is Sheila speaking?
Yeah.
Now my mind's rather vague on this, I have to say, but I do recall a paper not that long ago commenting that the tube feet were different on different, or should I say, two different types of tube feet on different sea stars, such that if you pulled ones off that had glands that secreted a glue-like substance, you would lose the tube feet, which is why they were recommending, please try not to take the sea stars off the rocks. And I can't recall sort of what the other variation was, whether it was just not as much glue or they were merely suckers that were holding on and therefore would fall off easier on, on a a parallel slope or something like that. That's very vague, but there seems to be a difference between 2 feet on various different sea stars.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sheila.
Yeah.
And I see Lynn has her hand up.
Yes, thank you. Uh, Phil, do you have any specific papers, or have you kept up with the research on the warm blob and possibility of bacteria being the main cause of their demise? Are there new theories out there? I'm really interested in that. Thank you.
Well, as I said, that's one of the theories, that there's a buildup of bacteria on the upper aboral surface and essentially smothering the oxygen supply to the animals. But I don't know if that's been proven one way or the other. People are still working on the problem, trying to figure out what the real cause is. Is there a single cause, or is it a whole rainbow of different causes? I don't think it's been decided yet.
Maybe a cascade of effects.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
Mhm.
you're suggesting it's more of like a smothering effect with the bacteria covering the gills, possibly?
Well, that's one of the theories. Yeah, that's just from what I've read of other work. It's not personal experience or yeah.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Thank you. And then Sarah, I think you have your hand up.
Hi, great talk, thanks. Sorry, I thought of another question just while I was listening to that. Do they also have any oxygen exchange in the water that they bring in through the madreporite, or is it strictly from the dermal branchia? And my question that I was originally going to ask was, do you know, because I know that there are commensal scale worms that you can sometimes find
Yeah.
on leather stars specifically. Do you know if there are any other kind of either parasitic or mutualistic relationships by sea stars kind of in this area?
Well, actually, most species have scale worms on them somewhere, either in the ambulacral groove on the underside or on the upper side. So they're fairly common, and I think there's some that tend to be specific to a certain species of stars, but the other, I don't think the drawing water into the madreporite is a source of oxygen, because it's only occasionally it does that if the liquid in the water vascular system is kind of reduced or dried up, that brings in a bit more and to sort of replenish the what's missing. So I don't think it's a source of oxygen.
Cool. Thank you. We had one more question in the chat from Noel, who is wondering if there's any evidence of some sea stars' lesions healing. Have you heard of any evidence of that?
Oh, no, I haven't. I mean, we know that sea stars have great powers of regeneration, so it's certainly feasible that they could heal once whatever is causing it has gone away. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know the answer. I can just surmise.
Thank you. And then Kathy, I see you have your hand up.
Hey, Phil, thanks for the talk. It was great.
Oh, hi.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts about, we do have an Evisterius that seems to have lost a leg from wasting, but it seems to have pulled through and it's cruising around in our seawater table.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
So that's an interesting one.
Yeah,
But I was wondering more that question of no, the genetic theory suggestion that sea stars are actually all head.
um,
Do you have any thoughts? I mean, you've read about that. I was wondering
no,
if you have any thoughts on that.
no, I don't know whether I have. All head,
Yeah, so
in what sense? They don't have a brain.
no, but it seems like they don't have any a gene expression of that's specific to trunks or any of that stuff. Seems the gene expression is all very typically, for the head, including say the retinol expression is all over the bodies of this starfish.
Oh,
So that's
I don't know.
it's a discussion that's going on out there. I just thought maybe
Oh, I guess I haven't tapped into that one. I'll have to talk to you about that.
yeah, I can send you I can send you the reference, or I can put it up.
Yeah.
Cool. And then Melissa in the chat posted a comment that said there's been some new research at the Oregon Coast Aquarium developing a protocol for helping sea stars to recover from wasting disease. And she's linked a YouTube video. And so if anyone's interested in learning more about that, you can go to the chat and click on that link, and then that will bring you to the YouTube video that Melissa posted.
So is that some kind of a hatchery program or something, or are they trying to repopulate?
I can answer that. So
Oh,
it's basically it's in Newport, Oregon, and it's the aquarium, and they've had issues with maintaining the health of sea stars at the aquarium because they use seawater from the ocean.
right.
And so it's a protocol as sea stars start to become susceptible and affected by sea star wasting disease, that they have a protocol that's like a vitamin water where they it's like an ICU for sea stars, and they're able to recover, which is
Oh,
great. That of course doesn't help us in the wild, but it's some information that can be used in the future, I hope.
yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Now, Kathy and Yogi, is your hand still up, or do you have a second question? Awesome. Well, I think in the interest of time that we will end this here, but we really, really appreciate you giving us your time tonight, Phil, and all of your expertise. And thank you for joining us on our speaker series. And we look forward to seeing everyone next month for Nikki Wright's talk on eelgrass. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Right, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.